Welcome back to Tipping Point. I'm your host, Kara McKinney. One of Sudan's two warring factions, the Rapid Support Forces, has declared a 72-hour truce with the Sudanese armed forces in order to observe the Muslim holiday Eid al-Fitr, which begins today and marks the end of the fast of Ramadan. A ceasefire would allow citizens to meet with their families, and it opens the door to humanitarian corridors to evacuate civilians. And fighting is currently happening north of the capital city of Khartoum, where it's been all-out war. The World Health Organization estimates the death toll in Sudan has risen to 413 people, with another 3,500 that have been injured since the fighting erupted on Saturday. The U.S. State Department has also confirmed that one U.S. citizen was killed this week. Tens of thousands of refugees are fleeing the country, and the U.S. government is positioning itself in the East African nation of Djibouti, which lies to the east of Sudan, to prepare itself for a possible evacuation of the embassy staff in Sudan. The U.S. has a military base in Djibouti and has troops on the ground to support the evacuation effort, although it's not yet clear how the government plans to rescue the estimated 19,000 American citizens that are stuck in Africa's third largest country. And there's fighting at the Khartoum airport, so doing this won't be easy. Each military faction wants to gain control of Sudan and presumably enact their own government, since the transition to a democratic one is exacerbating long-standing tensions about the idea of sharing political power. Joining us now to discuss is Tina Ramirez, the founder and president of Hardwired Global. Tina, thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me, Kara.
Great. So your company has a relationship with Sudan going back several years. Can you explain that for us? What's happening right now in the country?
Hardwired Global provides education and training to lawyers and civil society leaders across Sudan and South Sudan in religious freedom. And I mean, as many of your viewers, I'm sure, are aware, for several decades, there was horrific persecution of Christians in South Sudan while the country was still whole. And over 1 million Christians were killed. And then, of course, Darfur, you saw a couple 100,000 Muslims be killed by the Bashir regime. Bashir has been since kicked out. But what Hardwired's been doing is working with those leaders to develop legal protections for religious freedom in the Constitution. Obviously, when the military coup took place, all hopes of that have vanished. And now with this current conflict, I think many of the people are really terrified that the situation will, as you mentioned, unravel into a full-out civil war, and that there will be no hope for the peace of both Sudan or even South Sudan. South Sudan has been helping to negotiate the peace in Sudan recently, but the two countries are very intertwined politically. And when one is in conflict, the other is negotiating the peace agreement there, and vice versa. And the situation is extremely unstable politically, even in South Sudan. So this is a really serious problem. Churches are being attacked, and many Christians are afraid that the situation will go back to what it was under Bashir. Hameti, the leader of the RSF, is probably worse than Bashir ever was. He's got 100,000 troops under his authority, and many of them are not even Sudanese, and they're mercenaries that are willing to fight and kill and destroy people without cause. The situation in the capital right now, fighting has never really occurred in the capitals or in these major cities. It's always been out in the outskirts, in the villages. So now that we see it in the capital, which has always been safe, people are really on lockdown and very terrified. Churches are burning. Civilians don't know what to do. They can't get out. It's a very dire situation, and people are really concerned.
It is, and as you're talking about with civilians being trapped and Americans being trapped, we had one American citizen killed this week. Are there any parallels to almost what we saw with the fall of Kabul back in 2021? I know, obviously, different continent and very different wars and geopolitics leading up to both of these situations, but do you see something similar with some of the Americans and others trapped behind in Khartoum and elsewhere during this conflict?
Oh, well, I think the thing that rings true both in Sudan and anywhere else in the world is that people don't really think that America is going to stand with them. They think America will abandon them. And I think that the situation in Afghanistan is a really good indicator of the way people feel about our foreign policy in general, which is that they don't trust America right now. They don't trust that we'll stand with our own citizens, let alone with people that are searching for peace and democracy and freedom. And so I know that many peace-loving, democratic-loving Sudanese are really at the point where they understand that they have to fight for themselves. And it's unfortunate because America has always been a beacon light of freedom in the world. But under this administration, we've seen that they've abandoned democracy and human rights around the world, and the people struggling for it. And so I think that it's unfortunate. The United States has invested so much in Sudan and the peace there that it would be a real failure of our foreign policy to continue to ignore it today. But the situation here wasn't wasn't inevitable, and it was something that we knew was unraveling, and the United States should have shown greater leadership in. But unfortunately, since the Obama administration, we've seen that the United States has really abdicated its role in peace negotiations across Sudan and South Sudan. So this is unfortunately not surprising that the Biden administration is slow at the helm of actually leading for a stronger peace there. But it is something that we should take more seriously as a country that's invested so much in that region.
And are there other global powers that perhaps are acting through proxy in the nation of Sudan during this conflict? Nations like Russia, perhaps, or are there any other nations, or is it mostly just U.S. and regional forces?
Well, that's a great question. So Russia for a long time has wanted to control or gain access to the port in Sudan, which is a critical port on the Red Sea that would control access to a lot of African nations and trade, into the Mediterranean and into the Red Sea, and so or into the Gulf. And so it is critical that we that we don't allow them to do that. Obviously, we see what Russia is doing to the Ukraine and their alliance with China. China for a long time has been working on development across Sudan and South Sudan, and is involved heavily in South Sudan with the oil pipelines that go out through Port Sudan. But a lot of nations want to get involved. Egypt is involved as well. I mean, there's Sudan, I think, has about 6 or 7 nations that surround it. And so its prominence in the region is really critical for stability in Africa. It's, as you said, one of the 3rd largest countries in Africa. It's extremely significant. At one point, if it could be fully utilized, it could feed all of Africa. I mean, just to give you an idea of the rich nature of the soil there. Hemedti, the leader of the RSF, has been trading with gold with some Russian oligarchs, I believe, for many years now, and that's made him a lot of wealth. And that obviously is what he's, partially using to fund the conflict and his leadership in Sudan. We can't forget, though, that Osama bin Laden was harbored in Sudan by Omar al-Bashir for many years. Omar al-Bashir is the one that essentially raised Hemedti, the head of the RSF. And so this proxy war between him and the general is extremely frightening, because it does lead to a totally different power dynamic within Africa and U.S. engagement in the region. So we can't take it for granted. We really do need to take the violence there seriously and engage in Sudan, because it's for our own national security interests as well.
Well, Tina, I really do appreciate your analysis on this conflict. Thank you so much for making time for us tonight.